All right. All right, well, we think we have a technical malfunction downstairs, and they're going to have to replace some equipment, so I think we're probably just going to have to get rolling here in the interest of time. This won't happen when 5G gets here, just so you know. But let me just say good afternoon and welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming. Today I've convened this hearing of the Senate Commerce Committee to explore ways to maintain global leadership in the race to 5G while ensuring the benefits of remarkable new wireless technologies reach rural America. Over the past 2 years, I've convened several hearings of next-generation services and what we can do in Congress to help lower them. I'm pleased that today we will be able to discuss these very important issues right here in South Dakota. I've heard from stakeholders throughout the country who represent American businesses that are on the ground building and maintaining our communications networks, deploying the infrastructure, and bringing to market cutting-edge technologies like autonomous vehicles, precision agriculture, and remote healthcare services that will transform our everyday lives. Groups representing a range of stakeholders from healthcare to agriculture, the automotive and manufacturing industries, internet companies, in deployment decisions. Additionally, I'm very pleased that the FCC, as part of an effort led by Commissioner Carr, has just taken an important step to modernize its siting rules consistent with the goals of the Streamline Act. As Mayor Tenhaken knows, making infrastructure siting easier is particularly important for those of us in rural America, where the business case for deployment is different than in large metropolitan areas. Lowering deployment costs is especially important in more rural communities where we simply don't have the population density to justify deployment if those barriers are high. Excessive fees, delays, and uncertainty can ruin the case for deployment of 5G for a community. I'm proud that our home state of South Dakota is leading the way in 5G. Dr. Griffiths and Dakota State University are training the young men and women who will design and protect our 5G networks and the services that they will offer. Mayor Tenhaken and Commissioner Carr are leading the way with their work to establish rules and policies that encourage 5G deployment. And Justin Forde from Midco, Mark Shlanta from SDN Communications, and Robert Fisher from Verizon are working to deploy the 5G networks and related infrastructure that will bring South Dakota the next generation of wireless communications. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I look forward to hearing from you and an opportunity to enter into discussion as we get a chance to fully drill down on some of these issues and what we can do to bring 5G more quickly and more effectively here to South Dakota. So I'm going to start on my left with Commissioner Carr, Brendan Carr, who, by the way, is his second trip to South Dakota, and every time he comes out here, he goes and does things and enjoys the state, and today climbed a 2,000-foot tower, I'm told, so maybe he'll tell us about that. But I appreciate the interest that he's taken in the challenges of delivering these types of services to rural areas of the country and his attempts to understand the unique needs and challenges that we have. So we'll start with him and then move to the Mayor of Sioux Falls, the Honorable Paul Tenhaken, Dr. Yosei Marie Griffiths, who's President of Dakota State University, Robert Fisher, who is Senior Vice President of Federal Government Relations for Verizon, and as I said, Mr. Justin Forde, who's Senior Director of Government Relations at Mid-Continent Communications, and Mr. Mark Shlanta, who is Chief Executive Officer for SDN Communications. Great to have all of you here today. Thank you for being here, and we'll start with Commissioner Carr. Please proceed. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Thune, for the invitation to testify. It's great to be back with you in South Dakota for this field hearing on 5G and to join this distinguished group of witnesses. I can think of no better way to identify the barriers that slow down deployment and the steps we can take back in Washington to remove them than spending time like this outside of D.C. On my way here, I spent time in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. I heard firsthand the challenges that broadband providers face in building next-gen networks in rural America. And I saw the grit and determination that telecom crews demonstrate in getting the job done. Whether it was Justin on top of an already snow-covered grain elevator in Thompson, North Dakota, that's now beaming broadband to the community of 1,000, or with Steve while he attached a new radio on a water tower in Shorewood, Minnesota, that's adding capacity to the network. Or this morning with Amos and Mike on the 2,000-foot tower in Rowena, South Dakota. These visits underscore the work we need to do to make these jobs easier. This week, I also heard from the Great Plains innovators, job creators, healthcare providers that simply would not be operating in these communities without a broadband connection. So this field hearing is important. It puts our shared goal for 5G front and center. We want every community in the country to see the economic opportunity that 5G can enable. Spectrum and infrastructure are key. So I want to commend the committee for leading on them. Chairman Thune championed the Mobile Now Act, which frees up the spectrum needed for next-gen services. And I want to acknowledge both Chairman Thune and Senator Schatz for their work on the bipartisan Streamline Small Cell Deployment Act, which would cut red tape that's been slowing down small cell deployments. And at the FCC, we're building on the committee's efforts. In the US, as you know, we're on the cusp of a major upgrade in wireless to 5G. The Wall Street Journal has called it transformative from an economic and technological perspective. And they're right. Winning the global race to 5G, seeing this new platform deployed in the US first, is about our economic leadership for the next decade. Those are the stakes. And here's how we know it. Think back 10 years ago when we were on the verge of upgrading from 3G to 4G. Think about the largest stocks, the biggest drivers of our economy. It was big banks and big oil. Now it's US-based technology companies that have transformed our economy and our lives. Think about your own life. A decade ago, taking a road trip, like I've done this week, meant walking into your local AAA office, telling them the stops along your way, and waiting for them to print out a triptych booklet filled with maps that you'd unfold as you drove down the highway. Now an app lets you get real-time directions right on your phone. American companies led the way in developing these 4G innovations. And it's not by chance that the US is the world's tech and innovation hub. We have the strongest wireless economy in the world because we won the race to 4G. And being first to 5G will matter even more. As Deloitte put it, first adopter countries could sustain more than a decade of competitive advantage. And after all, we're not the only country that wants to be first to 5G. One of our biggest competitors is China. They view 5G as a chance to flip the script. They want to lead the tech sector for the next decade, and they're moving aggressively to deploy the infrastructure needed for 5G. Since 2015, China has deployed 350,000 cell sites. We've built fewer than 30,000. China is deploying 460 cell sites a day. That's 12 times our pace. So we have to be honest about this infrastructure challenge, and from Congress to the White House, to the FCC, to state and local leaders, we have a plan, and we're executing on it. For our part, the FCC is working to get the government out of the way so the private sector can construct the hundreds of thousands of new small cells needed for 5G. In March, we excluded small cells from the costly review procedures designed for 100-foot towers. That decision cut $1.5 billion in red tape, and one provider is now clearing small cells for construction at 6 times the pace as before. So we're making progress. But when I think about success, when I think about winning the race to 5G, the finish line isn't the moment we see next-gen deployments in New York or San Francisco. Success can only be measured when all Americans have a fair shot at next-gen connectivity. So just 2 weeks ago, the FCC took another step in the right direction. We built on the bipartisan ideas championed by Senators Thune and Schatz, as well as dozens of state and local leaders. We streamlined the local permitting process. That decision cut another $2 billion in red tape, will stimulate $2.4 billion in new small cell deployments, 97% of which will be in rural and suburban communities. And we can accelerate that progress with the common sense ideas contained in the Streamlined Small Cell Deployment Act. Doing so would represent another solid win for the U.S. in the race to 5G. So Chairman Thune, thank you again for holding this hearing. I look forward to hearing from the other witnesses and welcome your questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. And again, thank you for the time you've invested in understanding South Dakota and what our needs are. We really, and for everything you're doing on the FCC. I couldn't applaud more the steps that you and your fellow commissioners are taking in this to prepare and get us ready to win that race. Mayor Tenhaken, who's a tech entrepreneur as well, and so understands these issues really well and is working aggressively, I know, here in the city of Sioux Falls to do everything possible to help speed up and enable us to take full advantage of some of these technologies. So thank you for the leadership that you've taken and look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for being here.
Chairman Thune, thank you for holding this hearing today in what you already know is the greatest city in the world, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I appreciate the opportunity to address you today on the importance of internet connectivity in Sioux Falls and how 5th generation of internet connectivity is incredibly important to South Dakota and to the upper Midwest. Sioux Falls is a growing city in the heart of America. Continued investment in connectivity like 5G helps ensure that South Dakota remains a technological player in the national and international market. With the dawn of the digital age and internet, we've seen a new wave of business fueled by entrepreneurs like myself. In 2008, I founded the marketing technology firm ClickRain here in Sioux Falls. Thanks to the explosive growth of the internet and digital commerce, our company quickly found our way onto the Inc. 5000 list 5 years in a row as one of America's fastest growing private companies, and soon became one of the largest marketing technology firms in the upper Midwest. My background in this space gives me a heightened level of interest and expertise on a subject of which I am quite passionate about. Today, nearly every sector of Sioux Falls' economy counts on a fast and reliable internet connection. Organizations like Avera Health are operating one of the most robust e-care backends in the country right here in Sioux Falls. CarsForSale.com is a .com success story that has created hundreds of jobs here in Sioux Falls. DocuTap, just up the street, provides hundreds of tech careers, delivering EMR software to urgent care clinics all over the world. The common thread of success amongst all these companies, fast, reliable connectivity. As the United States strives to be one of the first nations with a fully functional 5G network, the city of Sioux Falls strives to be the first mid-market city with a 5G infrastructure. Right now, wireless carriers are negotiating small cell tower location review fees and easement fees with local governments to install 5G infrastructure. and that's happening right here in Sioux Falls. As mayor, it's not my intent to profit off carriers to deploy 5G infrastructure. We seek fair and reasonable compensation for city staff time to review applications from carriers, and in turn, we offer a reasonable time frame to approve or deny these applications or work with the carrier on an alternative site. Lastly, we want easement fees that cover the inflationary costs we incur with carriers locating their technology on our city assets. It's a very basic ask. Make the city whole on our costs to review and house the infrastructure that carriers need to deliver this connectivity. It is critical that federal regulations protect local governments and allow them to set reasonable fees that cover costs. Giving carriers authority to set fees that are unfair to local governments is, in essence, an unfunded federal mandate that will cost local governments tens of millions of dollars when you consider the thousands and thousands of small cells that will be deployed across the nation in the coming years. 5G plays a pivotal role in the future of economic development, workforce development, and innovation in this city. For autonomous vehicles to be safe and viable, we need 5G. For enhanced public safety with high-definition feeds for police officer cameras, we need 5G. The opportunities 5G brings to our community are endless, and I look forward to working with this committee, the FCC, and carriers to successfully and expeditiously deploy 5G in Sioux Falls. So in closing, I want to thank Chairman Thune for your leadership in this area. Your vision for streamlined 5G deployment across the U.S. that is fair to communities, consumers, and carriers is a step in the right direction. I am excited to foster and support 5G in Sioux Falls as we seek to grow our technological footprint in this city and remove unnecessary barriers for entry for this critical infrastructure. We're ready to help you lead this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And again, thank you for everything you're doing, really, in the bold vision that you've articulated for Sioux Falls, and I hope that can be replicated all across our state and across our country. It's moving the ball in the right direction, and the sky's the limit in terms of, I think, what we can do, but it takes the right kind of leadership, so thank you. Dr. Jose Marie Griffith is the, as I said, president of Dakota State University, and I think everybody is well aware of the terrific work that they're doing in cybersecurity and the young, bright, talented people that they're producing that are leading the way on a lot of these technological fronts. So thank you for being here. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Chairman Thune, for the opportunity to testify today on this important topic of next-generation communications infrastructure, services, and applications. I'm especially pleased that you chose to hold this hearing in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, not only because it brings you home, Senator, but because I strongly believe that South Dakota represents the 68% of the country's tweener population that live between the East Coast and the West Coast. I'm passionate about ensuring that more than 2/3 of the country are not bypassed by the next technological revolution, along with its need to connect not just the last mile, but what one of my colleagues calls the last inch. I believe the best way to address the three issues that you asked of us is to start with a coordinated effort to develop widespread understanding and knowledge of what 5G and the cyber universe, what I call the cyberverse, are, and why they're so important to the economic health, security, and quality of life for the United States in both the near and far-term future. As impressive as today's internet is, it's clear that our present telecommunications and cyber environment have major problems with limited bandwidth, unacceptably long latency, slow speeds, and inadequate reliability, inappropriate dependencies on users for security and maintenance, and interoperability chaos. At the same time as we're hitting a brick wall with our existing technology and networking approach, users are increasingly demanding far more than simply access to information. The complex problems of our 21st century world require a more complex and fluid ecosystem of participants, machine and human. People don't want to just access or give information, they want to interact with it, to be immersed in the process of its creation as much as its use, analysis, extension, and dissemination. And they don't just need to interact with it by themselves, they need to collaborate with multiple others in a three-dimensional environment where they can tap into people, machine-to-machine, and people-to-machine interactions, more like an ocean than a highway. I believe to make the greatest progress most rapidly, we should create a public-private partnership to build and deploy a real-world 5G and cyberverse testbed. 2 years ago, Dakota State University developed the idea of South Dakota 5G, we call it SD 5G, as one, if not the first, 5G ready state. We believe that our state has the characteristics and resources that make it the ideal place for such a project. We're eager to move forward to create for the nation a model of how to address the various challenges of this transformative approach to the delivery and use of technology. South Dakota is a geographic area in the United States that contains a cross-section of the types of population clusters and organizations, geography, climate, industries, and existing technologies to explore, troubleshoot, and establish best practice models for the technology, as well as for the policies and governance required to support 5G deployment and development across the country. Those who think of South Dakota as home to vast farms on the plains, buffalo and cattle ranches stretched across the buttes, and the lifestyle of Little House on the Prairie and Native American heritage should be aware that these days the state is also home to impressively sophisticated technology development and cyber innovation. Silicon Valley or Boston's metropolis are rapidly being matched by a technology revolution in the center of the United States. DSU's cybersecurity and Raven's Loon system are matched by multiple enterprises across South Dakota, working at the vanguard of precision agriculture, cutting-edge and distance delivery healthcare, and robotic manufacturing, among others. To develop and deploy these new technologies in a manner consistent with the country's democratic values and concerns, we must engage cybersecurity professionals in every aspect of this testbed. With great power comes great responsibility, and that's never been more true than with the development and deployment of 5G and migration into the cyberverse. 5G is what will make it possible for us to move into the Internet of Everything. However, every time we connect a new device to the network, we also potentially open up a new set of vulnerabilities. And the US is sorely lacking right now in standards and best practices for security to build into Internet of Everything devices, or the software that can easily be installed as part of the basic features of any device. The US is presently seriously under-resourced in cybersecurity professionals. And the vast majority of cybersecurity professionals that we do have are overextended, working to mitigate and remediate existing internet attacks, which multiply faster than the proverbial rabbits. However, it's critical that the US ensure that a network upon which every activity in this country is dependent is developed in such a way that vulnerabilities are reduced as much as possible, and that the US's 5G and cyberverse cybersecurity expertise proceeds in step with the development of our national 5G networking capability. And this is one area that's of such common concern and serves every individual and enterprise in the country that it would be appropriate and maybe necessary for the federal government to help provide the upfront investment in the recruitment, education, and deployment of cybersecurity professionals in 5G development. 5G and the resulting cyberverse are a common good, whose availability and operability will be critical to every endeavor across the United States. As such, it's important that the federal government provide leadership and corral support for those efforts that will move development and deployment of this vital national resource. It's also the case that we'll only have one chance to do this first. According to a study released by Deloitte Consulting, the United States is losing the race against China to develop and deploy a nationwide 5G network. And there's more at stake here than just prestige. The National Security Agency has stated that if China dominates the telecommunications network industry, it will win politically, economically, and militarily. In addition to the concerns of national security, there's no question that the first country to effectively deploy 5G will also reap enormous macroeconomic gains. The first to deploy 5G in the cyberverse in a real-world setting will also be the country to understand the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats related to the new technology. The United States was the first country to develop and implement the comprehensive internet, initially building on the foundation and integrating multiple federally developed networks. The results have been clear and impressive. Despite all of the concerns about cybersecurity issues and technology dependencies, there is no question that the United States' lead in developing and deploying the internet has had profound economic and societal impacts. There is a need once again for the federal government to step forward and take the lead in investment and organizational support for the development and deployment of 5G and the cyberverse. In summary, we need a coordinated effort to develop widespread understanding of the benefits and implications of 5G capabilities, accompanied by the creation of a public-private partnership to build and deploy a real-world 5G cyberverse testbed, preferably across South Dakota. Of course, I'm biased now, and engage cyber professionals in all aspects of testbed development and deployment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Griffiths, and for the great work that you and DAC State are doing in this space. And it's going to take a lot of very trained, skilled professionals to protect these and safeguard these networks too as we develop these new technologies. So it's exciting stuff that you're involved with. Next up is Mr. Robert Fisher, who, as I said, is Senior Vice President at Verizon and a Senior Vice President of Federal Government Affairs, but he is here today, and we welcome him to South Dakota and hope that Verizon is looking at investing heavily in these types of technologies in our state. So thank you for being here. Mr. Fisher.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Robert Fisher, and I am Senior Vice President of Federal Government Affairs for Verizon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here to discuss 5G and the policies that the United States needs to adopt to win the global race on 5G. On a personal note, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you as a former staffer of the Senate Commerce Committee many years ago under then Chairman John McCain. It's a real honor and a pleasure for me to be here today. Earlier this decade, Verizon led the way in deploying the nation's first 4G network. Mr. Chairman, here in South Dakota from 2013 to 2018, Verizon alone has invested more than $119 million in private capital. Today, our 4G network covers more than 98% of the U.S. population, and now we are leading the way on 5G. For example, Verizon created the 5G Technology Forum, led the way with a number of technology firsts on 5G, built innovation labs to help create next-generation applications, and we were the first in the world to launch a commercial 5G service called Verizon 5G Home, which is currently available in Houston, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, and Sacramento. Verizon plans for rapid expansion of 5G Home and the launch of 5G mobility service going into 2019 and beyond. But it's helpful to begin our conversation by looking at what came before 5G. The first generation of mobile technology, 1G, was about voice. 2G introduced text messaging. The move to 3G provided the essential network speeds for accessing the internet through smartphones. 4G, with faster data transfer rates, gave rise to many of the connected devices and services that we rely upon today. Ultimately, 5G will be even faster, allowing greater network capacity, more opportunities for connectivity, and improved reliability. 5G also represents the potential for up to 1,000 times the network capacity of today's 4G LTE network and 20 times faster download speeds, and the network latency will become even faster than a blink of an eye. We believe the economic and social impacts will be transformative, and 5G will usher in a true fourth industrial revolution, which will fundamentally change how we live, work, and play. It will be the foundation for other technologies such as artificial intelligence, autonomous cars, robotics, and biotechnology. In addition to providing a long-sought competitive alternative to cable broadband, as Verizon's 5G home service does, 5G will provide for an enhanced mobile broadband, such as new and immersive virtual reality experiences, mission-critical communications, the connections that are required for the full capabilities of self-driving cars, and the connecting of the Internet of Things. It's critically important for the U.S. to lead the way in 5G. The wireless industry's impact on the state of South Dakota due to the evolution of 4G technology already accounts for $587 million in gross domestic product and 6,700 related wireless jobs in the state. We want 5G to build on that success of 4G. Commissioner Carr said it best earlier this year, quote, "The stakes are high. Winning the race to 5G could mean 3 million new jobs, $500 billion in GDP, $275 billion of private sector investment, all without a penny of new taxes. We want that, but our friends and competitors in Europe and Asia want that too," end quote. To underscore the commissioner's point, all of this is being done with private investment. Fortunately, the FCC and Congress have both made great strides to win the race to 5G with a focus on infrastructure and spectrum policy. 2 weeks ago, under Commissioner Carr's leadership, the FCC issued a ruling that adopted common sense guidelines that reduced the time and cost of deploying next-generation wireless infrastructure while accounting for legitimate local interests. The FCC's ruling built on the momentum established over the past few years in numerous states and communities to reform infrastructure siting. In terms of spectrum policy, the FCC has moved fast to open up more spectrum and frequency bands that have traditionally not been used, or that not have traditionally been used for cellular communications, but are critical for 5G. Last week, Commissioner O'Reilly outlined a plan for moving forward on the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum to be considered at the FCC's meeting later this month. Likewise, Mr. Chairman, you have been leading the way to advance 5G infrastructure policy in Congress. You and Brian Schatz, the senator from Hawaii, have introduced the Streamline Small Cell Deployment Act, or the Streamline Act, to help promote the deployment of small cell equipment. The Streamline Act modernizes deployment policies while ensuring states and localities have the ability to recover their costs. You've led the way in ensuring to critical mid-band spectrum, which is a critical component of 5G deployment. Mid-band spectrum provides a good mix of coverage and capacity and is essential for a broad nationwide rollout of 5G technologies. Verizon has always worked well with policymakers at all levels, Mr. Mayor, and hope to do that around the country and ensure that we are building our country's biggest and best network is accomplished with the cooperation and support of our government partners. While some municipalities have expressed concern about having a standardized framework for governing antenna siting, I can assure you that Verizon believes in dialogue and compromises between providers and localities are more important than ever, and we remain committed to that goal. The U.S. needs to win the race to 5G, and while Verizon is investing and innovating to help us get there, it is critical for federal, state, local governments all to be rowing in the same direction. We have to get this policy framework right. With your leadership, Mr. Chairman, and working with the members of the Senate Commerce Committee, the FCC, and other policymakers, we're making great progress, and I have high hopes that U.S. will lead the world on 5G network deployment. I thank you again for being here today and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. And you want to show us the...
Oh, yeah, sure. Here's a I won't say what company it is, but it's a sample of a 5G small cell. This is, approximately the size of things that we're looking at deploying in places all around the United States. So
compared to, fourth generation technology, which is much larger. And
much larger 200-foot macro cell sites, yes.
So that's the next generation, and what cities like Sioux Falls and other cities around the country will need to deploy to benefit from this. So thank you, sir, for being here and for your comments. Next up is Mr. Justin Forde, who is the Senior Director of Government Relations for Mid-Continent Communications, which has a big footprint here in South Dakota and all across this region of the country. So thank you, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. There's a lot of talk about how to address the digital divide in rural America, but at Midco, we are currently solving and closing the digital divide through our fiber and fixed wireless broadband solutions. And 5G technology will continue to expand Midco's opportunities to provide more fiber and fixed wireless here in South Dakota and across our footprint. Chairman Thune, thank you again for inviting me here today to discuss Midco's view on 5G from the field in the upper Midwest. Midco is the leading provider of internet, networking, cable TV, phone, data center, home security, and advertising services in the upper Midwest. We serve more than 400,000 residential and business customers in South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Kansas, and Wisconsin, in communities ranging in size from less than 100 people to more than 180,000. Midco has almost 10,000 miles of fiber, and in 2017 we launched our Midco Gig initiative, a commitment to bring gigabit internet speeds to our entire service area. To date, we have invested over $56 million in our Gig initiative, and that's over and above the millions of dollars we invest in our network annually. Today, Midco Gig is available to more than 80% of our customers, and it's affordable and accessible at every address here in Sioux Falls and communities large and small, with more to come in 2018. We also recognize that fiber is not the only solution to solve the digital divide. Many of our most rural and remote residents do not have access to broadband or have access to speeds that are so slow that the service is essentially non-existent. This digital divide is devastating to our friends and rural residents and businesses and in smart agriculture. So in 2018, Midco inquired of Visimax, and we have begun to expand broadband wireless service more broadly in most rural areas within our footprint. Fixed wireless allows us to reach rural areas that are up to 50 miles away from our fiber network. I myself am a Midco fixed wireless customer. I get my internet from the top of a grain elevator 8 miles away to my small farmstead. On a normal day, my 3 kids are streaming video while my wife is using that internet to run a small business. This service has been a great asset to our family. My fixed wireless broadband ultimately connects to Midco's fiber backbone, and fiber will continue to be the backbone of any connectivity solution, including small cell 5G technology for urban areas like Sioux Falls or Fargo. And given our deep fiber network, we are able to partner with the mobile carriers to provide the necessary connectivity link from small cell towers to the internet. The discussion about emerging small cell technology for urban areas is continuing to gain momentum, and Midco is here to support mobile carriers by providing that connectivity. Small cell will create deeper fiber penetration in our communities, and we are excited for that possibility. Small cell technology, however, is not the likely solution to close the digital divide due to the density of towers needed. For example, we estimate that 350 small cell towers would be needed to provide 5G service to Sioux Falls with an area of only 74 square miles. While technology that requires end users to be in such close proximity to a tower is a possibility in our more urban areas, it is not realistic in some of our more rural areas. But fixed wireless has been and will continue to be a solution. Instead of hundreds of feet between a tower and a consumer, our fixed wireless network can beam high-speed broadband 5 to 28 miles between a tower and consumer. Midco currently provides fixed wireless broadband to large portions of the Red River Valley, with approximately 14,000 square miles using 140 cell towers, water towers, and grain elevators. Fixed wireless is closing the digital divide today. As Congress and the FCC continue to support emerging 5G technology, we at Midco are excited for the possibilities that next generation of technology spectrum will bring for our fixed wireless network. In the race to 5G, Midco has 2 suggestions for Congress and the FCC to ensure that 5G discussions include opportunities for rural America. First, as Congress and the FCC work to free up additional spectrum and drive the use of that spectrum in rural America, it's vital that fixed wireless providers like Midco have both access to the spectrum and the financial ability to purchase licensed spectrum. As more spectrum is made available, we ask that the rules regarding spectrum also consider the technology needs for fixed wireless, such as higher power allowances. Large rural providers that desire to purchase licensed spectrum should have the ability to compete with large mobile carriers in spectrum auctions. To that end, the FCC and Congress should revise the rural bidding credits to allow larger rural companies like Midco to take advantage of such credits to build out our networks. Second, it is vital that fixed wireless providers have access to new laws aimed at advancing small cell technology so we can also benefit from those reduced regulations. This committee's Streamline Act contains similar provisions to the FCC's recent ruling on small cells, and we encourage lawmakers to continue considering fixed wireless when revising rules at the request of small cell operators. Chairman Thune, thank you again for inviting me here today, and we look forward to working with you all to continue advancing 5G technology while also closing the digital divide.
Thank you, Mr. Forde, and we appreciate you being here and look forward to have the opportunity to ask some questions about what the things that your company is involved with here in South Dakota and across the region as well. So, last up is Mr. Mark Shlanta, who's the Chief Executive Officer of SDN Communications here in South Dakota and has been at this for a long time and has a lot of perspective and background, I think, that can be very useful as we head into this new frontier. So, Mark, welcome. Good to have you here.
And Chairman Thune, thank you. And thank you for inviting SDN to participate in today's hearing. The prospect of 5G in South Dakota excites me. South Dakota has long been at the leading edge of broadband, especially in rural markets, thanks to the progressive approach of SDN's owner companies, the independent telephone companies of South Dakota. Our companies cover 80% of South Dakota's geography, and they aggressively combat the digital divide. In fact, SDN and the South Dakota Telecommunications Association recently commissioned a broadband benchmark report. 3 things I wanted to highlight. First, 65% of the SDTA members, their customers, are connected by fiber. 76% of their customers have high-speed broadband speeds that meet or exceed the FCC's broadband definition. And third, in the 5 years from 2013 to 2017, our members have invested over $400 million in networks that now total 45,000 miles of fiber in South Dakota. That's enough fiber to circle the earth twice. This leads me to my primary point, small cells and fifth generation networks. In the end, it's still all about the wires that I will refer to as the 6G fiber optic networks that support such advances. When I use my smartphone to send a message to my mother across town or to my sister who lives in South Korea, nearly all of that communication will travel through the fiber in the ground or under the ocean. It's only the very last part of the connection from the handset to the tower that is wireless. Today's 4G and tomorrow's 5G wireless do not exist without the 6G fiber that empowers them. SDN has extensive experience in the field. We partner with all the wireless providers in the region to provide backhaul from the towers and front haul to the small cells. SDN played a key role in deploying some of the first small cells in the region. We helped deploy dozens of small cells in places like Aberdeen, Brookings, Sioux Falls, Sioux City, Sturgis, and Yankton. One of the best examples is the new SDSU Dana J. Dykehouse Stadium in Brookings, which holds 19,000 people. Even a few thousand fans had previously overloaded the mobile data capacity, making it impossible to text and pull up a web page or post to social media. That could paralyze a university and drive away fans, especially younger ones. SDN worked with a wireless carrier to secure locations, permit, and construct the poles. Fans now have a better digital experience there. More importantly, these and other small cells will play a role in public safety. These small cells represent the precursor to 5G. We will need many of these to make 5G work, and all of them will have to connect to our 6G fiber. Chairman Thune and Commissioner Carr, I want to thank you for the lighter regulatory touches that you've allowed, especially the shot clocks encouraging local governments to act. In the past, it could take months, and in some cases, the regulatory and siting expenses exceeded $25,000 per pole. This did not include the monthly fees to cities, campuses, and other property owners. I encourage continued streamlining. However, I also believe the federal and state governments should find a balance for local control. We worked cooperatively with the governments in Aberdeen, Brookings, and Sioux Falls to make positive local ordinance changes. I'm pleased to say the South Dakota Municipal League is aggressively working to create model ordinances for cities large and small to attract 5G services to South Dakota. An additional reminder, network security is critical as we advance faster wireless services. 5G will expand the Internet of Things and the IoT devices we all use, but network security should not be overlooked. Our state's academic resources can assist to discover vulnerabilities and develop security measures. In conclusion, our fiber assets run deep into the rural landscape, and our early experience in small cells, along with the combination of local governments ready to embrace 5G, not to mention Dakota State University's technical expertise, makes South Dakota the perfect test site for everything from driverless vehicles to wearable devices, which are the applications of 5G. All of it will improve rural quality of life and offer our strikingly independent South Dakotans the opportunity to live, work, and create wherever they please. The diverse weather, culture, and geographic conditions will offer the best test of 5G and leverage the promise of our 6G fiber optic services. Thank you, Chairman Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Shlanta. Let me just follow up with you while it's fresh in my mind here, but with the passage of the Mobile Now Act, we did make a down payment on the spectrum and infrastructure needs to secure American leadership in 5G, and the Streamline Small Cell Deployment Act represents sort of the next step on that infrastructure list, and we recently held a hearing focused on ensuring that we have the additional spectrum necessary for 5G. From your perspective as a provider of services to wireless carriers, what else should we be doing to support the deployment of 5G, particularly in states like South Dakota?
Thank you. States like South Dakota, in the urban centers, we all have reasonable fiber optic networks to help with that deployment. Coordination at the local effort in terms of working with the local governments for placement of fiber optic facilities will be key. But in the rural markets, if 5G were to ever, I think, long-term extend into those rural markets, we must maintain I'll say the support aspects of developing more fiber optic networks across the rural networks. The cost to deploy a rural network far exceed the cost per mile and the cost per customer to support that is used to support an urban customer. So I would just make sure the federal government doesn't overlook the needs of rural as we deploy 5G across the urban environments and extend those into the neighboring rural environments.
And in your experience, do you think that the siting policies for small cells should be different than policies for larger sort of macro towers like what we see today?
I do, because they are far less obtrusive. I think some of the pictures that we're showing during my testimony, indicate they are really similar to a municipal light pole. And I know that's many of the co-location efforts that wireless carriers are looking to work with the communities on, is to co-locate on those types of infrastructure. The early poles that we deployed largely were a standalone facility, and those can be used in places where maybe a light pole or just the traffic volumes really wouldn't allow us to get that type of infrastructure close to the communications or to the transportation systems, but to have that separate facility. So a lighter touch on those smaller facilities is important.
Yeah, thanks. Mr. Forde, Midco's been particularly resourceful in deploying both fixed and wireless services to the people of South Dakota. For example, as you point out, deploying antennas on grain silos to provide wireless broadband. Could you discuss maybe how Midco has overcome some of the challenges to deployment in rural areas and some of the lessons that you've learned?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we were also lucky to have Chairman Carr with us earlier this week as we climbed some elevators across the footprint. So it's very exciting to be up there. Obviously, when you look at deploying those networks, as Mr. Shlanta said, that cost can be very high. And when you look at our highly rural areas, and obviously as the temperatures dip, there's only a limited amount of time when you can deploy some of those fiber networks. The fixed wireless solution, the speed, reliability, and throughput that has continued to improve with the improvement of technology. So deploying that fixed wireless from our rich fiber networks in the cities that we do serve really allows us to reach those rural farmsteads. It allows us to reach that 25 to 30 miles around there for precision ag, all those tough to reach places. Also, we have a very diverse geography here in our state and across the region, whether it's Badlands, granite cliffs, lakes. You just can't get the fiber through that. So this is really a unique way to continue to close the digital divide and reach those hard to reach areas. And it can be deployed relatively quickly. I mean, you can call and just within a few hours in some of those rural areas, we can have that technology out to you at very high speeds.
You talked about the need for spectrum being available to fixed people who are providing fixed wireless services too. So what else do you think we could be doing to make it easier for you and others that are serving rural America to get access to that spectrum? You talked about it needed to be accessible and affordable.
Yeah, I think obviously as spectrum is made available, it needs to be available in a way that we can have access to it. We like county size license sizes for spectrum, so that's something that we can feel is a good fit for us to afford. Access to some of the bands of spectrum, the 2.5 gigahertz can get through some trees and get through some denser areas, which allows us to ultimately serve that customer better. So, making sure that we have access to that will be helpful. Of course, we also provide video services as well through satellite, and we got to make sure that there isn't any interference with some of that spectrum as that's made available for more fixed wireless. So there's a good balance that needs to be found there as we make more spectrum available.
And you talked too about and I understand 5G is going to require different types of infrastructure in rural areas, some of which may be impractical in rural areas, but what other connectivity solutions can Midco offer?
Well, I think it's, that advancement of 5G technology, the fixed wireless is similar to that, and some of those technological advancements are also advancing that fixed wireless technology. So obviously, working with both and advancing those technologies will allow us to continue to have better 5G technology in our cities and also reach some of those hard to reach last areas.
Okay. Mayor, just out of, in terms of the things that you're doing here, and I know that you, as you mentioned earlier, and I think we're all well aware of you understand and get what's at stake here and are working hard to make it easier to build out some of these networks in the city of Sioux Falls. But could you talk a little bit about maybe what the implications are for economic growth and job creation if 5G deployment is slowed down by a delay in the approval by local, zoning and siting applications?
Yeah, me and my administration look at 5G as much as an economic driver and a workforce driver as anything. And in South Dakota, like a lot of places, we have a workforce challenge. We have a hard time recruiting people to come to Sioux Falls to put down roots here and work, even though we know the secret of this place, and it's a great place to be. And so being able to offer advanced technology like 5G as a point of differentiation to whether that's new college grads or whether that's people pivoting in their career and using 5G as a point of differentiation for Sioux Falls, in addition to our favorable tax climate and our safe community and our great quality of life, it would be a tremendous win for us in helping to fill the workforce shortage that we have and helping to recruit businesses here. We've recently invested in a biotech research park called the USD Discovery District, which we hope will someday house a couple thousand jobs centered around ag pharma and biotech, and those jobs are going to require 5G connectivity to be done. They're going to be jobs that rely on a good access. And so a slowed down 5G rollout is only going to slow down some of those advancements we want to make as a city in terms of looking at biopharma jobs and bringing in new jobs to our city.
In your experience, do you think Sioux Falls is properly equipped, right now, to be a leader in 5G adoption?
I think this is one topic, just because of my background, that I am really passionate about. And I've talked a lot about this, and there is a hunger and an appetite in this city to be a leader in this space. And so we've seen that in our negotiations with the carriers. When we're talking with them, we're saying, listen, we're not trying to make money on the deployment of these cells. We want to cover our costs, and that's it, because we don't see this as a revenue source for the city. We're not looking at it that way. We're looking at it, the win is going to happen once we have the network. That's when the money will come in through those jobs, through the economic development, and so forth. So most of our community leaders are thinking that way as well. So the time is really right in terms of the mindset in Sioux Falls to be a real early adopter in this and a leader in this.
Thank you. Dr. Griffiths, I was interested in listening to your testimony and then reading it earlier too. You talked about, there was an interesting comparison. It's not a super highway, it's more of a super ocean in terms of the way that the connectivity that will exist as a result of this when it's deployed. But could you talk about how 5G will improve education tools both for students and faculty at a university like Dakota State?
Yeah, certainly. It'll do a lot of things. First of all, it's like the mayor said, if you have the advanced technologies, the advanced infrastructure, people will come to work in it because we'll have it and other places won't. So that's one thing that will help. In terms of our ability to reach out to work with K through 12 education and with our own remote students, half our students are remote, we'll be able to extend out virtual reality experiences for our students. We can train them in what we call hand skills, the ability to convey tactile information with a 5G network is going to be very strong so that we'll be able to train them to do certain things. On Friday, I had an interesting conversation about a robotic dairy farm, which I happen to know about, which is strange. Self-milking cows, and they were talking about potentially locating this dairy outside Madison, South Dakota, and that they were very interested in Dakota State because they were interested in the students and the graduates we have, because a robotic farm is going to need people who can take care of the robots as well as taking care of the cows. It's not just the cows anymore. The robots also need certain care and feeding as well. So, but I think the biggest thing that 5G in this area would do is to keep many of our graduates in this state. As you know, we're sort of very technologically advanced with our graduates. 57% of our high-tech graduates leave the state. We want to provide them opportunities to stay in state. Many of them would prefer to stay in state. And so I think by putting the infrastructure in place that will enable 5G services, we will attract the industries and the jobs and the innovation and entrepreneurship to occur within South Dakota, to bring people in, to bring people back, and to keep our graduates here.
And among the subjects that you've studied is how the digital revolution has affected research.
Yes.
So what do you see as the impact of 5G on the ability to collect and use information, and what that might mean for the economy and for how we live our lives?
Well, information is power. So, there is this ability to collect a lot of information about how technology is used, how people are mobilizing new applications, and all of that data can be gathered and analyzed in interesting ways. So, for example, we're looking now at law enforcement information, the number of cyber attacks that people have seen, analyzing the data on who's attacked, where, by whom, what kind of attacks, etc., where the vulnerabilities lie, allow us to take those patterns and project out into industries so that we can be more proactive in preventing those kinds of attacks. So there's a tremendous opportunity. If you have the information and you gather the information, that pool of information gives you the ability to know more than anyone else and to go out and help people fix the kinds of problems that they're having. So it's a huge advantage. And we believe that, plus the specialized resources that we're building in Madison, South Dakota at DSU, will attract people in, so that we'll be able to attract new faculty who might not otherwise be attracted, we'll be able to attract students who might not otherwise come, and we'll be able to attract partners to come and work alongside us in this part of the country, rather than staying out on the fringes, as it were.
Good. Magnet, yeah. Commissioner Carr, I mentioned earlier some of the things the FCC is doing, which I give you great credit, you and your fellow commissioners, because I think you're very forward-looking, and many of the ideas that are incorporated, I think, has been pointed out by several of the panelists in the Streamline Act legislation. The FCC has been moving forward with, and or at least moving forward in areas that are consistent with the goals that are outlined in the legislation. So, so I just think you guys are really hitting it and hitting on all cylinders in terms of what we need to be doing. But could you speak a little bit further to some of these recent FCC rulings, and particularly about wireless infrastructure and what it means for 5G deployment?
Sure. And thank you, Senator, for your leadership on these issues. We benefited a lot from the FCC, from the legislation that you've introduced, the ideas that you've put together, as well as local leaders, including the mayor. There's been 20 states around the country that adopted updated procedures to account for these new small cell deployments. And if you think back, a lot of our regulations were written in an era of almost exclusively 200-foot towers with large footprint. There were environmental reviews, historic reviews, costs, timelines that maybe made sense given that massive construction project. But when you have a small cell the size of a backpack or smaller, like the one we had now, when it can go on an existing light pole, those outdated approaches didn't make sense and were holding us back. So in March, we reached a decision that excluded these small cells, but only the small cells, from the environmental and historic review that applied to those 200-foot towers. And there was an economic study put in the record that showed that March decision cut about $1.5 billion in red tape. And we saw situations, for instance, where you can put a 30-foot tower in a parking lot that had been completely the ground was disturbed, new pavement put down, but nonetheless you had to go through a historic preservation review as if you were turning the ground over anew, and you could have a deployment costing $30,000 where the environmental review would cost $27,000. So it was out of step with the technology, and that's why we reached the decision in March. And then 2 weeks ago we reached another decision that really builds on a lot of the ideas that we heard the mayor just talk about. Cities absolutely need to be compensated for their costs in reviewing these deployments. They can't be going underwater reviewing the private sector's investments. They need to be made whole, as the mayor made clear. And that's what we did in our decision. We made sure that cities get their reasonable costs compensated, but that this is not a revenue-generating opportunity that the mayor said, because we need to move forward on a scope and scale of small cells that we've never done before. So we have to clear out the red tape that's been holding it back.
Yeah, and I'm glad that South Dakota is leading the way on that too. And you heard earlier that the South Dakota Municipal League here in South Dakota coming up with a draft ordinance for cities to adopt that would enable these infrastructure to be placed and be built out. So And what you and the commissioner are doing, I think, dovetail nicely with all of those activities. So we want to continue to encourage that. And honestly, I mean, we have, as we look at these issues, obviously we want to be respectful of the prerogatives of local governments and authorities and do it in a way that strikes a balance, but also in a way that's reasonable and doesn't stand in the way of what I think is going to be an enormous economic opportunity for our cities and our states and our country. What are the implications, to follow up on your point about citing policies that go beyond cost-based recovery?
Yeah, we saw evidence in our record that small cells are particularly sensitive to excessive regulatory fees. And we saw a record where providers were looking to deploy in relatively small communities across the Midwest, and excessive fees resulted in them pulling back and investing that deployment in an area where the fees were a lot more reasonable. We saw record evidence of excessive fees in big coastal cities that would suck up the capital needed to deploy small cells in surrounding communities. So we saw real impacts in terms of the regulatory fees impacting where deployment takes place and whether deployment is going to take place.
Yeah. Thank you. Mr. Fisher, we had Meredith Baker, who is the CEO of the CTIA, testified before the Commerce Committee earlier this year, and she said, and I quote, "A small cell often can be installed in about an hour. The challenge we face is that governmental approval processes can take more than a year, and the application and fee structures are often mismatched with the smaller footprint of tomorrow's networks," end quote. So could you kind of expand on this concept for us and explain how we can remove red tape and get infrastructure deployed to spur jobs and growth and get broadband competition more quickly?
Yeah, I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, I agree a lot with what Commissioner Carr just kind of pointed out, which is, I think historically, when you've looked at the way that we've had red tape around expanding cell coverage, we thought of cell coverage, especially in 2G all the way up to 4G, about, large macro towers and historic preservation reviews and, EPA, NEPA regulations, EPA regulations. There's a lot of things that went into that process. And I'm not saying that wasn't incorrect maybe at the time, given the size of some of those things. But as we move to really taking 5G, and the way I like to describe it to folks, like I think about my parents and trying to explain like what we're doing on 5G, when you're taking the network out closer to the consumer and trying to make a service that is going to be, 1,000 times faster than we have today, you need to realize that when we're, deploying something like this, the same things that Commissioner Carr pointed out and the regulations that surrounded large towers applying to this really don't make sense. And the time, the amount of money that go to that definitely do get more exercise towards that process and really take away, potential investment in other surrounding areas. So I think continuing to, encourage, and I hope that the Senate will take up the Streamline Act and pass it, because I think it's a perfect complement to what Commissioner Carr and the rest of the FCC have done, which is really getting some of that underburden out so that we can get out there and quickly deploy. Because I think it's crucial that we do it, because we know that China and others are working very fast to do this, and I think it's critical that just as we led the world in 4G deployment, the U.S. should lead in 5G deployment.
Well, and because you mentioned it, I want to follow up on the point you made about the steps. I ask the question this way: what steps do we need to take to win the 5G race when you have other countries like China and South Korea and Japan and Europe? Everybody is headed in the same direction here, but are deploying communications networks at a faster rate. Yep. In a lot of cases, they don't have to deal with, of course, some of the the regulatory issues that we have in our country. But so, what if you wanted to say we want to win that race? What are the steps that we need to be taking that you think are necessary?
Well, I think we've taken a critical first step in what the FCC has done, and I think that's good. I think building upon what they have done and passing the Streamline Act would be critical. I do agree with what Mr. Forde said too. We need to identify mid-band spectrum, which is critically important. I agree with a lot of what he said on the mid-band side. It's important to get more spectrum out there as quickly as possible. A lot of other countries have been doing that for many years and have been rushing to do that.
Can you talk just a minute and follow up why mid-band spectrum is important?
Yeah, well, I think as we moved to, as we've thought about cell service was always about like big towers, low band spectrum that can penetrate through low band frequencies that can penetrate through walls, really cover big distances. As we move into 5G, we're looking and deploying right now using what they call millimeter wave spectrum, which is high frequency, and the higher you go up, the shorter distance it travels, but it has the ability to carry massive amounts of data. But in order to have all these things work, mid-band spectrum is going to be very complementary with high-frequency spectrum and low-frequency spectrum, quite frankly, because as you push the network out further distances, you're going to need a combination of short traveled distance spectrum to longer distance traveled spectrum to be able to cover larger areas. So all of those things are going to be very complementary to one another, and it's going to be very critical for those things to happen, I think, in a very thoughtful but speedy way, so that we don't fall behind the rest of the world. Because I think the most damaging thing that we could do is take a longer amount of time to do this, because we would be missing out on billions and billions of dollars of global economic cost to the U.S. because we led in 4G and we saw all the benefits from it. It's how the app economy exploded in this country, and probably a lot to what the mayor and the businesses that he ran. That was really largely because of the way we did networks here in the United States. If we continue to do that here in 5G, we will continue to develop things that we can't even know or understand, things that students at Dakota State are trying to develop today. So it's just vitally important that we move forward quickly.
And with all, it sounds like all the various bands of spectrum play into that.
Correct.
But mid-band is especially valuable.
Very valuable, yes.
In terms of, okay. Dr. Griffiths said it'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question because it's kind of what you and your folks do, but 5G does offer the ability to connect to many times more devices to the internet than we currently have. It will higher level of connectivity, lower latency, tremendous increases in speed. But what challenges does this raise for cybersecurity?
I think, as I mentioned, every time you connect a new device to the network, you create the potential for new vulnerabilities, not just in the device itself. In hardware, coded in hardware is particularly a problem. In software, it's a little bit easier to detect. The other challenge I think that we have in this environment, as it moves so rapidly, is making sure we pay attention to the privacy concerns of the public. That now people are becoming more aware of devices that are actually recording them, and they we take it for granted that things will work the way we think they're going to work. But again, bad actors are always in play, and we need to always be mindful of that. So we do educate some of our young people to think like that. It's a different way of thinking, to be more proactive and looking at the cybersecurity environment, to actually test things out in a proactive way to ensure that they can find potential vulnerabilities. And I think it's a concern as we shift generations. So I'm afraid I'm a generation that saw the birth of the modern internet. So, my mind works in certain ways, and I'm glad I won't have to deal with the waves of innovation that will come. But young people today have a totally different approach to the way they interact with technology, the way they think about privacy, the way they deal with data, etc. So it's a totally different world. So I think there are going to be some social strains and stresses on the system that are going to actually eventually have to be worked out through governance structures and policy, etc.
Okay. I'm glad you're training people to understand the bad guys, but getting them to work for the good guys. That's what we want to have.
Make sure they keep their white hats on.
Right. And I would just say, too, if anybody else on any of these questions wants to jump in, if you have a perspective you want to add, feel free to do that.
Mr. Chairman, I was actually just going to follow up on something that Dr. Griffith said, because I think it's important on the privacy front. And I agree, there's a lot of work being done on the cybersecurity front that relates to 5G and privacy. But you in particular, but this committee has been very engaged in the privacy debate. You've held a series of hearings over the last couple of weeks on privacy and what we should do. And as you know, Verizon's been pushing for comprehensive privacy reform for the last 6 years. And we believe it's well past our time to update those laws, primarily for some of the reasons that Dr. Griffiths brought up, but it's critically important that consumers have a sense of their privacy, and I think a lot of what we've seen over the last couple of years is certainly putting a lot of pause into people and Americans across the country who are trying to figure out how their data is being used. So while I know it's somewhat relevant to this hearing, I think it's an important topic and something that the committee, hopefully, and that the Senate and the House can pass legislation in 2019 to update our nation's privacy laws.
Couldn't agree more with that. Mr. Shlanta, obviously we're all talking about swift action on 5G spectrum and deployment and how critical that is, but much of that massive amount of data is going to travel over 5G networks that will travel over SDN, and the thousands of miles of fiber that you and your members currently operate. How is this increase in data traffic going to affect your business?
Well, first of all, thank you. You know, the change in consumer behavior that we've seen, especially in the 4G world, as things really moved to the handset in terms of how transactions started to take place. You know, we'll see that double, triple, 10 times in terms of the number of transactions that'll take place over the next decade across those handsets. All of that, of course, gets gathered up across those wireless networks and then transmitted across the fiber networks. You know, one of the things that we are planning for and have been continuing to invest in is the expansion, not just the reach of our fiber network, but the capacity of the fiber network, the optical network behind the glass that not everyone sees. And so we're already laying the groundwork to upgrade those aspects of our network. Some of those are already in place as we're seeing the deployments that the wireless carriers are bringing forward. But I'll say the opportunities and challenges it brings, some of the opportunities are, I'll say, staying current with the technology and finding the right workforce and being able to hire them and attract them to a state like South Dakota. And, you know, that's one of the challenges. One of the opportunities is just being able to meet those challenges. It may be somewhat cliche, but those are the kind of things that drive, I know, largely my technical team to the office every day to work and discover on those types of activities. But if I could, I'd like to build on one other statement or a couple of statements that were made here today, and I wanted to build on, it was really when the mayor was speaking earlier that it was hitting me. And I think if you go back and look at the record today, you're going to find people who talk about, all of us in terms of witnesses, talk about 5G and what's coming and what's coming to South Dakota. But, you know, I want to make sure that the carriers and the people who are here recognize that South Dakota has, first of all, a willing government environment. You've heard the mayor talk about that. You've heard the municipal league talk about that. You know, we want to attract the 5G deployments to our state. You've heard different speakers talk about really the diversity of our climate, the diversity of our populations, the diversity of our environment. So there are great testbed opportunities that come here. And we talk about the technical resources that not only SDN, but Mr. Forde and Mid-Continent offer to the carriers as we come. I would say lastly, and it's the thing that I think people overlook at times, it's the network security. We want to push this forward, but we cannot overlook the network security aspects. I ran into you earlier this week in Washington. You were headed to the White House and I was headed to a cybersecurity briefing. And just to hear those business leaders talk about the needs for security in their transmissions, was driving the point home. So I just want to make sure that as a government official who helps drive legislation, that you don't overlook the security aspects. We bring that along at the same time we bring along all the other aspects of our networks.
Good.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Mayor.
Somewhat of a pivot from what Mark just talked about, but I want to make sure we get this out before the hearing ends. And the one wet blanket piece of this that I feel we need to also address is what health impacts micromillimeter waves have because it's so new. And as a mayor who's sitting on this panel and the media's here, I'm going to get asked this 20 times yet this evening about the health ramifications of 5G and small cell deployment in MMW. And I've been getting asked it a lot already. And I know there's no documented studies because the technology is so new. And it reminds me a little bit of when microwaves came into our home and people were concerned about the microwaves and holding a cell phone to your head is going to fry your brain and these things. And I'm hearing this more and more. And so while the concern, I think, is very inflated, it is something that we as municipalities are going to need help addressing. If we want to be excited and push this forward, which we are, we also need to have very clear direction, talking points, studies that have been done that show that there is no harm to our constituents and to the taxpayers on putting these small cells on towers close to libraries, close to schools, close to their homes. And so I, for one, have been researching this and have not seen any damaging effects of this, but I do think it's something that this group, will have to just consider to look at and continue to study so that as we push the legislation forward, we can do so with not only a clear conscience, but also have the right answers for people who express that concern.
Yeah, good point, and that is something that you do hear. We hear about it too, and I'm sure the FCC
I'm happy to step in real quick on that. So the FCC, as well as other agencies that are experts in health and safety issues, are always looking very closely at these issues, staying up to date on the latest science. They've looked at all of the studies and all the information, and they've reached the determination that these are safe. And that's a determination that is constantly undergoing review, and any new information that comes up is taken into account. And in fact, given the position of the federal agencies on this, federal law actually says that state and local governments can't take RF concerns into account, given how much work has already gone into this issue at the federal level. And that's not to say that you don't hear about these concerns, and we have community meetings that people raise the concerns. But what I can say is that at the FCC and other expert health agencies in Washington, they stay very much up to speed on these issues and have reached the determination that these are safe.
And I appreciate that, and you're right, Mayor. There is a lot of research has been done, but it's always important that efforts be made, I think, to educate people, your constituents, my constituents, people across this country who have that concern, and make sure we're fully informed and understand exactly what, if any, those health risks are. But as I studied, and I haven't read a lot about it, the literature that you and the FCC, I think, have, I think most of it comes to the same conclusion in terms of the impacts, but it's something certainly that we need to be able to explain and be aware of. I want to ask Commissioner Carr, just because we were talking about it earlier, but between the auctions that are scheduled for this year and next, there will be a lot of new high-band spectrum coming into the market, but we were talking about mid-band spectrum and how desirable that is. Are the FCC's allocations of mid-band spectrum keeping pace with such allocations for high-band spectrum? Can you talk a little bit about what the auctions and what you guys are doing over there?
Happy to do so, Senator. Thanks for the question. I think to start, obviously, the Mobile Now Act, which you got across the finish line, has put a lot more spectrum on the table, which is going to be key for deploying 5G networks. We've heard a lot about what we call at the FCC high-band spectrum, and that's going to be a key part of some of the initial 5G deployments. But ultimately, we need to push 5G down the spectrum band, including mid-band. And if you look at all the spectrum globally, the U.S. is leading the world in terms of allocating and freeing up more spectrum for mobile, but a lot of that is in the high millimeter wave band. So right now, we are turning our focus very closely to what we call mid-band spectrum. We have a number of proceedings underway, and we need to keep pushing forward, to your point, to get that mid-band spectrum out there.
Okay. We're kind of getting to the time when we need to wrap up, but I just wanted for any of our panelists today to respond to kind of a couple of wrap-up questions or any closing remarks that you'd like to make or anything that you feel we didn't touch on that we need to touch on. But just one question to think about, and that is, what can we do at the federal level to help speed up deployment in South Dakota and around the country? My goal is to have South Dakota have the fastest internet speeds in the nation, in the world for that matter. But so obviously I'm greatly interested in that as it pertains to our state here. And then how is this next generation technology that we've talked about today going to change what you do every day, and how is it going to change what we all do? I mean, it's kind of, I know it's kind of a broad question, but and maybe it gets to a little bit some of the benefits and potential attributes and virtues of this technology, but what can the federal government be doing to speed it up? And secondly, how does it change what we do every day, and how is it going to change how we all live every day? So think about that for a minute, and anybody who wants to chime in, feel free. But just kind of, and then if anybody else has anything else they want to close out, Mayor.
Yeah, I think there's still so much unknown because it's going to be the Wild West again, and so there's innovations that haven't even been thought of yet, which will bubble up as a result of 5G deployment. So I think that's why it's so important to keep the foot on the gas on this, because there's things we haven't even thought of yet. And there's things we have thought of. For instance, I was talking with our police force today and was sharing with them the fact that with 5G, we would be able to have HD live feed, body camera footage going back to Metro. So rather than them having to call in when an officer's down or a shot's been fired, they're seeing it in real time in HD, and the response times would improve. And they hadn't even thought of that as an application to what would help them better serve the public. So I think there's so many things and so many doors that would be opened, which is why I think most of us up here are really excited at the opportunity. With Dr. Griffiths, we've talked about between a partnership with Madison and Dakota State and Sioux Falls. They are, the Cadillac of cybersecurity colleges, and they're cranking out amazing grads, but they also know they have challenges being in Madison, South Dakota, and we're in Sioux Falls. And if we can create a 5G network and a 5G kind of pathway between Madison and Sioux Falls, we could really be known as a cybersecurity, it could be the next industry that this state is known for. But it's going to take that technology before we can make that a reality. So I guess my closing statement is just things like the Streamline Act and mobile now, keep the foot on the gas on it. I think you have a lot of municipalities that want to be supportive and want to help. They also want to make sure it's fair to the taxpayer on the deployment. But there's a lot of excitement and energy for what could be.
If I could just add to that, it's ultimately going to be all about the services and applications, but you can't get them until you've got the infrastructure in place. And if you delay on putting the basic infrastructure in place when the services come out, it'll take you longer to get that infrastructure there. It reminds me very much of Internet 1 to Internet 2. I mean, a group of academic institutions wanted to put in the next generation of Internet so that we can experiment with it and see how it worked. We didn't switch our regular Internet use to that Internet 2. It was purely a research network. And a number of my colleagues at the time were reluctant to sign up. So I was the first one to sign up for Internet 2. We're now talking academically about Internet 3, but it's the same environment. My feeling was, how could I sit and not have my faculty and students have access to the best resources available to them? And I'm sure you think the same about your constituents. How can we not make available the potential of all this capability once those services come available? We can't think of what those services would be. I don't think anyone would have imagined Amazon to have grown to be the behemoth that it is in all the different areas it's doing business. But the business, the applications, the innovations will come, but if the infrastructure is not in place, then you're behind. And once you're behind, it's hard to catch up.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that, I think this discussion today has been extremely helpful. I think all the work that's being done at all levels of government is really, I think there's a real effort by a lot of folks, I think at the federal side, the legislation that you are championing through. We remain committed to hopefully try to get that bill passed. I think the mayor brings up, excellent points. I mentioned it in my testimony. I'd like to underscore it again. I mean, we're working very hard at a local level to, talk to cities all across the country and have these discussions about getting our investment, out there as quickly as possible. So I think just keeping the foot on the gas pedal, I think, is the theme that we're using here on the federal side. And I would say to your last question, the capabilities of 5G right now is basically wherever your mind can take you at this point. And I think that whether it's, students that are currently enrolled at Dakota State or universities across the country, I bet if we sat here, even 10, 15 years ago and talked about the app economy today and what it blew up to, none of us would have ever guessed what would have happened. And, 4G took us there. I think 5G leads us to a whole different level of virtual reality, augmented reality, and even applications that we don't know of. The latency, that one thing that we didn't talk about that I'll just mention quickly, the latency as we go to 5G, that is the time, that the devices can talk back and forth in the network. Just an example would be that today if you take an autonomous car and it's traveling at 60 miles an hour and it's communicating over a 4G network and it has to signal that it's about to break, the processing time right today on a 4G network is about 4 feet. When it's going 60 miles an hour, about 4 feet is the processing time go back and forth. I think as we have autonomous vehicles, we can all safely assume that we want to make sure that things are happening very quickly and very rapidly. In a 5G world, latency, same example, car traveling 60, it goes from 4 feet to 1 inch of compute power. And the latency will be quicker than a blink of an eye. And so that really gives us unlimited potential as it relates to robotic surgery. Think about the things that we can do to take STEM education to the next level. Here, I think in many parts of South Dakota, what that means to ag tech and farmers across the country. So I think, let our imaginations take us where 5G is possible, but I think maybe 10 years from now, we could be sitting around here imagining all these things that we couldn't believe here today. So I think at Verizon, we're very excited about this. We have 5 labs, 5G labs that we're opening across the country. We have one open in New York right now. We're going to have some open in Palo Alto and Washington, D.C., Boston, and L.A. by the end of 2018. So these will really be test beds for people to come and test out technologies.
The mayor was here waiting to hear you say Sioux Falls on that list.
I was ready to chime in.
My understanding is that we've had some initial discussions and conversations continue, so we look forward to that.
Great.
Mr. Chairman, just thank you so much for bringing this hearing to South Dakota and for your leadership and your staff and all the hard work they put into keeping us a technology leader here in South Dakota. We're just so blessed to have all these companies together working so hard on this issue. I think that our fiber networks and our data center, our gig initiative, our fixed wireless, just making all these things a part of this process leads to the great environment that we have here in this community. And we're blessed to be able to work with everyone here at the table to continue to move things forward in our state.
One last thing I'd just like to say is, we've heard a lot today about 5G wireless. So much will happen, especially in the probably the urban centers as we get started. But I just wanted to also say thank you, Chairman Thune and Commissioner Carr, for all the work that you do in the rural networks as well. The needs of rural are different than we see in the urban areas. So I just wanted to say thank you for all your efforts there as well.
Also, we add real quick, I think there's still a number of great ideas in the Streamline Small Cell Deployment Act that's in Congress right now. And I'll also say today we were with the really talented crews of Sioux Falls Tower. And if you think about having about 15 to 20,000 cell sites in the country going up a year, well, next year we need to see about 60,000 a year, increasing from there. So it's actually a good job story, but we're at a point where we need to make sure we have the trained workforce that can do that massive increase in infrastructure deployment. I think there's work we can do on the apprenticeship side. I think there's work we can do on the community college side as well to get very quickly the skill sets into the community.
Right, thank you. Well, listen, thanks to all of you. Appreciate your input, your thoughts, your suggestions, and I think it's really exciting. And we've had a number of hearings in the Commerce Committee dealing with some of these new technologies like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and blockchain and other things. All of which I think become increasingly more possible. And I've used the example, Mr. Fisher, that you used with autonomous vehicles because, one of the things that the reason I'm interested in autonomous vehicles is that we lose 37,000 people every year on America's highways. 94% of those accidents are human error. And if we can eliminate just some of that, we can save a lot of lives. It needs to be done in a safe way. And obviously, it's much safer if an autonomous vehicle can stop in an inch rather than in, 4 feet? Yeah. So, these are the dimensions of difference and dimensions of benefit that happen when this kind of technology and the infrastructure and everything that supports it is put into place. So we want to encourage that investment. I'm excited to see the things that are happening already here in South Dakota and the great work that's already being done. But I really do believe the sky is the limit, and so we want to continue to partner and work with everybody here at the table as we as a state and a country win this race. So thank you all very much. With that, this hearing is adjourned.